Well, a very good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, to this BA community webinar. Um, those of you that have tuned in will notice the format is a little different today, which I think is a really positive thing. It's always good to try different formats. And the topic today you will have seen is around assessments. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because throughout our lives, we get assessed a lot, and we assess other things. And it seems like assessments are ubiquitous. Like organisations are chasing level 5 or level 4 this, and we talk about maturity. But how often do we step back and think, well, what are we actually assessing here? And what benchmark are we using? And is this the best or the most natural approach? So the style today is going to be very conversational. By all means, please do post comments in the chat window. We probably won't have the capacity to take questions, but we can certainly take a look at any comments. And it's my real pleasure, always a pleasure, to welcome today a friend and colleague of mine, Curtis Michelson, who's are you actually in Florida today, Curtis?
Yes, I am actually. Orlando.
Joining us from Orlando, Florida. And I've known Curtis for a while, not quite a decade. Curtis told me, don't say a decade, it makes us both feel really old. And we met, I think we were both bloggers on Laura Brandenburg's site, Bridging the Gap.
Right.
At conferences since, and we've enjoyed many conversations late into the evening on many philosophical and business analysis topics. So a little bit about Curtis. Curtis is founder of Minds Alert, a US-based consulting agency focusing on organizational transformation. And I know, Curtis, you've worked in all sorts of domains, whether that's media, publishing, education, non-profit. And I noted you describe yourself as a nerd for assessments of all types, especially psychometric profiling. So fantastic. So welcome, and thank you for joining us, Curtis.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's great. Great to be here as always.
Absolutely. So I think a really good place to start, Curtis, would be to say what do we mean by assessment? Because it's a really broad term, and how is it relevant for us as BAs?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first, I'm not going to pull any dictionary definition, but any assessment is a point in time measurement of something. Doesn't say anything more than this. At this moment in time, we took a reading, a reading of a situation or a person, or a company or an organization, whatever. And it is, as you referred to, it is based on some benchmark, some framework sits behind every assessment, some definition of better or worse, heading a certain direction. So it's just simply our way of getting a reading, putting our finger in the air and getting a reading which way the wind is blowing, right? And it's what we start with almost always as consultants, as business analysts. We're constantly reading, we're looking for assessments, we're assessing situation. I think we call it situational assessment.
Yeah, so and again, that's a really interesting point, Curtis, because in my head, I was thinking of assessments in quite a narrow way in terms of, well, here's a specified methodology for assessing something. But actually, I've had a bit of a penny drop moment, because you're right. It's like, even if you do, well, actually, where are we today? Where do we want to be tomorrow? And how do we get there? That's like a form of assessment, right? Because you're assessing the current state. So it's really, really quite.
I think it's hardwired in us as BAs, just that aspect of it right there, right?
Yeah. So why do you think assessments of all types are so popular and so prevalent in organizations?
We love numbers. We love data, and now AI loves data too. We've moved into an era where we can digitize just about anything and measure just about anything. And this is the risk. This is part of why I wanted to have this conversation, because I think we're over measuring too, or sometimes measuring the wrong things. There's that beautiful quote: an imprecise measure of the right thing is better than a precise measure of the wrong thing. And I can never chase down who said it. It's an anonymous quote, but it rings true over and over and over again. Even in the work I do with organizations as an agile transformation consultant, there's all sorts of metrics that people go kind of gaga over, whether it's velocity or other things. And then there's a couple really important things that rarely get measured, like team morale. Are people happy? And those can tell you so much more than some of these more quantifiable metrics. So I have an issue with how much we're testing, and I'll be very honest. Part of what drives me and gets me almost furious is how much we're testing kids today in education. I don't know what about the UK or Europe, but in the United States, we are testing kids like crazy.
Yeah.
There's 20 tests probably in the course of a year that are major tests, and there's lots of in-between tests. And they spend a lot of time practicing for the test. We call it teaching to the test. And teachers are frustrated with this because schools are getting graded based on these numbers, right?
And that kind of creates, I mean, I've got my sort of systems. I mean, you and I both share an interest in systems thinking. I've got my systemic thinking or thinking in systems hat on. And think about when you start to measure things in that way, you can create a situation that's worse for everyone, that is, or worse for the majority of people that are in that situation. I remember once having a conversation with someone who their organization ran an employee engagement survey. And employee engagement surveys sound like a very sensible thing to do, and I'm sure there are good ways of implementing them. But they were telling me that their manager had essentially said, well, senior manager looks on our department and how well we're doing based on this survey. So, do you want to be seen as a good or a bad department? You get to choose. And it's like, well, okay, if you incentivize the numbers in that way, you're going to get, you get what you measure, right?
Yes, yeah. And sometimes we have these, just perverse incentives that get created, right? Where people are just doing the wrong behavior in order to make the test look better, right?
Yeah, and I mean, and this goes broader as well, because you look at like financial mis-selling of policies or products. Well, actually, if you give people commission, or if you're berating people who don't make the figures, then that drives a kind of dysfunctional, or can drive a dysfunctional behavior as well. And all of these things are so relevant for anyone involved in change, because so often we're working on the processes and the underlying systems that define these measures, or even record these measures. And I don't know if you found this, Curtis, but one thing I've found on some process work I've done is initially organizations are measuring things because they're easy to measure. Right?
That's right. We
it's
measure
like, well,
what's easy. Right.
Yeah, well, we can measure the length of call time because it comes right out of the system. Like the call handling system gives us that, so we can just. It's like, but why? Why are you measuring it? And I'm not saying you shouldn't measure it, but if you don't know why, then
Yes, exactly. No, you hit on something very key there. We do want to. We're going to measure what's easy to measure, and that's not necessarily aligned with what we want to see as an outcome.
Yeah.
Going back to education, are the things that we're measuring really tied to successful student outcomes? This is happening a lot in higher ed, an area that I'm working in, somewhat. The real kind of question is, are we getting kids into jobs? Are we getting them are they better citizens? There's this much, much bigger frame to assess or measure people around rather than the grades, right?
Yeah. And sort of akin, going back to that employee engagement example, it's like, well, what problem are we actually trying to solve here? Is the outcome we're looking for higher scores on the employee engagement survey? Or is it making this a better place to work?
Right.
Because those are two different questions. Because you know what? If you want higher employee engagement surveys, just pay everyone to mark everything 10, and the majority of people will probably do that. But that's really interesting. So, but broadening the conversation out, and I'm sure we'll spring off some of these later on. But like, what types of assessment are there? So we've talked about, or we've sort of alluded to, assessing individual people.
Yes, one of my favorite things.
Yeah. And what other types of assessment are there for either assessing people or teams or organizations?
Well, you kind of hit them right there, right? People, individuals, they form teams. We assess teams. I've used several team assessments around the agile teams that I work with. We assess business units, so divisions. We assess organizations. We can assess governments, right? We can assess any community that we want. Right?
A whole government.
I know that's an area we both share too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, cities, communities, healthy neighborhoods. But again, behind every one of these is a framework. There's some definition of, there's an implied notion of maturity. What is an unhealthy city versus a healthy city? What are the qualities that one has versus the other? Right.
So that's really interesting, because there are, I mean, one of the things that I think a lot of organizations, I mean, and this, it'd be interesting to know if you find the same with your clients, but the kind of clients I work with are talking a lot about digital transformation. They're talking a lot about agile transformation, and starting to talk now about agility rather than just agile as a
right. We're beginning to do that.
Exactly. Yeah, we're starting to get there.
Yeah.
But so if we take, I mean, let's just take agile or agility, for example. Like, how do you assess organizational agility? I mean, it's like, it's a huge, you can't, and of course, it's not just, are you doing Scrum?
Right. 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 Let's talk about what would make, for example, a better assessment of agility. I think I'll just give you an example of someone I think is doing it well or on the right track. Business Agility Institute. I think the link is businessagility.institute if you want to check out the website. A friend of mine, Evan Laburn, has helped build a community of practitioners who are informing that framework that sits behind the assessments that they're doing. So, that's the first question. Where is the framework coming from? Is it just some person's idea of what they think the agile organization is? Or is it could it be crowdsourced? Could we have harvested the wisdom of a community of people who've been working for decades in the trenches on agility and have seen things that, were bespoke agile or looked like agile, but were really not? It kind of found those anti-patterns. And if you could crowdsource that community together and define a more robust set of metrics, that's what he's done. Okay. And already you got a fighting chance of making a better assessment if you've crowdsourced that community of people who know something about this topic. Right?
So this is about almost, or I think if I understand you correctly, you're saying that like probably a better assessment is when it's a whole bunch of empirical data and contributions that have been made across the world, rather than just someone's
PhD thesis. Okay. Yeah. And there's a lot of that.
Yeah. Or I mean, let's face it, there are frameworks out there that aren't even someone's PhD thesis. They're just an untested assertion.
Right. Right. Exactly. I mean, I'm guilty as charged. Let me be very, transparent here. I can tell you that I tried to, do something for the BA community. It wasn't all bad, but it was based on too limited a data set. I interviewed 2 business analysts and a project manager, maybe a couple other people, sat down with my buddy Cooper Smith. We came up with a framework called the Discovery Leadership Framework. Yeah, this feels right. And we put it out there in the world. Can I just show it just to
please, Curtis.
For instance?
Yeah.
All right. Just to, let's just put it all out there. Okay. So this was it. You can still find the website. We had a partner, Sally Alata from Agility Health, and I love her tools for teams. I think her teams are great. I mean, her tools for assessing teams are great. And I saw her speak at a conference. She said, hey, go ahead, create what she calls a radar. These are radars. And if I zoom in on it, she said, define for us what she was thinking of the business analyst that becomes product owner or product manager. What is that additional set of, what's the game they have to bring to the table? Well, we defined something that very few people can do great at all of these things, but they were, 4 major areas, each one neatly, look at the symmetry. It's so beautiful, right? 5 in each quadrant. Now, the truth was we had 4 in engaging for buy-in, but that would have been asymmetrical. So, Coop, we need a 5th. Right? That's not a very good reason to introduce a 5th sub-skill set just for symmetry. But this happens all the time.
Yeah.
These, as my good friend Adrian Reed once said when we were sitting at a conference at BBC, I don't know, 10 years ago or something, you looked over at me. We were in a business architecture presentation.
I'm really
I'll never forget this. You looked over and you said, we've made all this stuff up. I said, you're right. Babach is completely made up.
Well, and
Bisbach is all made up.
Yeah, and I mean, I know one thing where we've had lots of rich conversations in the past is, and this is just a personal view, but like a lot of things that we take for granted are just social constructs.
Yes. Yes.
I can still, it's like that moment for you. I had a moment. I was at an IIBA UK event in London a long time ago, and someone who's now a friend and an ex-IIBA UK colleague we'd worked with for many years, Nick Devoyle, and there was a panel about, well, you know, is this part? There was a panel discussion about, well, is this part? Are these tasks part of a BA role, or are they a project manager? Or but there was this discussion, and Nick just in the end just kind of said, well, I don't really see any reason why a BA couldn't do any of those things, or why they should or shouldn't. It's down to the context. I'm paraphrasing.
Yes.
But he sort of said, the boundaries are there because we set them.
Yeah.
And,
right.
The term business analysis, as we understand it, is only there because somebody, or in the BA Box case, a group of practitioners have put a boundary around it.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that you can't be something else and be a BA. And I mean, the BA Box recognizes that it's about the rather than the job.
There's a famous story of the BABOK version 1 getting written. Maybe it was in Kitty Haas's basement or someplace. It was someone's basement up in New England, right? Barb Corkenord or somebody. And they're all there, and they're all talking about how should we define these things that we don't know what to call them. And there was all these different words around what we call today non-functional requirements. And they finally landed on that. And they, kind of took a vote. But, this is just, and these are definitions that we created for utility to make it easier to talk about our craft.
Yeah.
And in some sense, they needed to define an assessment. Let's be honest, the classic assessment for BAs is a CBAP.
Yeah.
Something I have always had kind of an aversion to sitting for, not because I don't respect IIBA or tests or whatever. It's just that I never, I do worry that we test, and I see this in Agile worlds too. There was a great phrase used at a conference I went to in Montreal a couple weeks ago. It was an Agile Alliance conference, the Agile Industrial Complex.
Wow.
Yeah. That was a keynote or two, kind of set people back. But we've all seen people who've sat for the test, but they're not great BAs.
Yeah.
Right? And so what are we assessing by getting people that can memorize definitions? So there was something in principle I didn't like around the idea that I've sat and memorized all these definitions for something. But when do you actually see what I do and actually deliver and how I deliver?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, so, I mean, as you know, I am CBAP. I got CBAP on version 2 of BABOK, but I know version 3 cover to cover because of all sorts of bits and pieces of work I've done. Yep. I think one thing I found useful and I say this genuinely as a practitioner, was because you have to prove the number of hours of work you've done, I had to actually sit down and reflect on, and you're able to prove it over 10 years. So I went back and looked at what I'd done over 10 years and reflected, and it's like, wow, I've worked on this kind of project, I haven't worked on this kind of project. Maybe I should seek that out. There was like, for me, there was a sort of reflective or maybe even reflexive element to it as well. But I totally hear what you're saying, in that, there's only so much that you can assess without actually working with someone, like without actually seeing someone's deliverables. That's always a bit of a challenge.
Yes.
So,
another just common challenge, and this comes up with the psychometric assessments a lot. You're asking people to assess themselves. We're great, all of us human beings, at lying to ourselves. Really good psychometrically validated assessments have figured out ways to see if we are lying even to ourselves in a test. They'll ask you the same question multiple different ways.
Yeah.
A really high quality assessment in that regard would be the MMPI. I don't know if I think it's used internationally. It's translated into many languages. It's Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, MMPI. So if you want to become a firefighter or a police officer or anything where you're a public servant, it's just standard. You're going to sit for this test, and it's a battery of 500 plus questions.
Wow.
And it's standard because it's been shown over and over to be rigorously validated. That we are able to weed out schizophrenics and people who are trying to, monkey or play the numbers or try to not be truthful on the test. And there's a very subtle ways they do that. I mean, there's a whole science around psychometric testing. That versus it's not one I took a couple weeks ago. I don't want to name it, but it was someone's PhD thesis.
Yeah.
And I could just tell it's so early, it's out of the gate. It's kind of like our discovery leadership framework. It's not validated yet. There's no predictive value. So if I was going to give you a contrasting way to measure innovation in BAs, what we were trying to do with discovery leadership, if I share a screen again, let me just show you one that I found that kind of put
please.
Yeah, that I thought, wow, this is the way we should have done it. But it does require a lot more data. It requires a lot more inputs. But it's a framework called Swarm Vision.
Okay.
Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 categories. Think of those as the elements around that radar. These are 8 elements. They don't all have to be there, but depending upon which of those someone that sits for this assessment comes up strong with, has a bearing on how they perform in teams. And it's predictive because she's done, I don't know, the woman behind this is Susan Briganti, and I think she's done great work. And she, by the way, she comes out of a kind of psychometric background. She has that background, and so she understands how to do this right. 20,000 people have taken this assessment, and then she goes back and she says, well, those that measured very high for drive, how are they actually performing on your teams? Because her prediction was they would perform a certain way, and then she's been able to tweak this over time and adjust the questions. So now she gets to something much more important than assessments. It's prediction. Can this actually predict behavior in a team context, right? I know you've got feelings about Myers-Briggs.
Yeah,
MBTI.
I was hoping we could talk a little bit about that.
I knew we'd come around to that. I don't know if MBTI predicts anything about how someone behaves in a team. It's certainly interesting to talk as a team about it, and there's a lot of learning and growth that happens when we do that. But this definitely has proven itself in corporate America and companies that have put their people through this, and those who have been strong in deliver or control have predictably performed certain ways on teams.
So it's kind of prediction rather than just interesting, rather than self-awareness. I mean, self-awareness is good, but this is actually prediction.
Thank you. Exactly. So what could make this radar be that good is if we had, hello, BAs out there in the world. How many do we have on this call? 22? We need about 22 times 100 to start getting some data. And we have a lot of data points. And then we would go watch those BAs perform. And then we would interview their managers. And then we would hear from other people the impacts that those BAs had on projects. And then we would refine this model further. We would adapt the questions further. And we would keep doing that process, like evolving this framework and the questions that we ask. We would get closer to predictive if we could do that.
And I think that's one of my concerns about assessments, is that you do come across assessments where they might be based on some research or not in some cases, but they never move, or they rarely move. Right. And then what happens is it becomes the purpose change, or almost the purpose of the assessment changes, because it becomes about licensing. And it's about selling. You train the trainer courses, and then trainer courses, and then licensed practitioner courses, and then selling the license to the question set and the material, and so on and so forth.
Yep. And
that, to me, that's. I don't want to say it's polluted the purpose, because we've all got to make a living, right? Mm-hmm. But it's a different thing from a community-based, or right, even an enthusiastic bunch of individuals wanting to do something for the community that they care about.
Right. I agree. And to, again, give a little props to Evan and Business Agility Institute. Mm-hmm. They're constantly asking the question, what's wrong with the model? How could it improve? Because they're not selling certifications against it. The business model that PMI and many other organizations are based on, professional organizations, is a BOK, a body of knowledge, which defines the good and the great and where we should be, and a certification package that goes with it. And that makes sense as a business model. It's a proven business model. The downside is it limits how often you can evolve the model itself.
Yes.
And I think what I like about Evan's approach is he's got nothing holding him back from constantly adapting and improving the model of business agility. He's not trying to sit on that IP. He has a different business model based on conferences and other things like that.
Yeah. On cultivating conversations, we might.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So okay, so I do want to come back to MBTI because
yes, let's talk about those psychometric personalized ones.
So if you're not familiar with, so some people listening in may not have heard that term. So MBTI is the Myers-Briggs typology indicator. Is that
temperament?
Temperament. See, what do I know? And you know, I mean, I am an INTJ.
Hello, I'm an ENTP.
Yeah, you're an E something, that's for sure. Like the E oozes out of you. So I is introvert, E is extrovert, but that doesn't mean introversion and extroversion.
No, yes.
Really understand it.
Right.
And so I mean, so the thing about Myers-Briggs.
Yes.
So I struggle. One of my concerns with Myers-Briggs is you can be presented with something and it can then shape your behavior because you're sort of put into a box.
Mm-hmm.
Or depending on how it's applied, you can be put into a box. And like, are you familiar with Barnum statements?
Say again, Barnum?
Barnum statements.
No.
Okay.
Tell me. Yeah.
So Barnum statements are a form of linguistic pattern that are used by, well, let's say they're used by magicians who are wanting to present as if they are psychic. Okay. They might also be used by charlatans as well. Who knows? But you can actually write, and there are ones out there if you Google them, where if you present them to someone, they look at them and say, "Yeah, that's me." Like, you know, like I've thought about writing a book and I've never got round to it, and you know, I feel like I'm an independent mind, and they're just.
Is this sort of the basis of trade for every good astrologer who writes that prediction that you go, that's me?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know the technicality, but my wonder, and I've never really thought about this, but are the Myers-Briggs actually, are they narrow enough, or are they Barnum statements? Because you know, you go back to the validation thing. If you look at the history of my understanding of the history of Myers-Briggs, there's not an awful lot of scientific rigor there, and you look at peer-reviewed journals, and it's been repeatedly debunked. I mean, pretty repeatedly.
Yeah, and
that doesn't mean it's not useful, though.
Right. Let's separate scientific validity from usefulness.
Yeah, but
something to separate there, because the journey that we take people through, everybody reports something positive out of learning that process, especially learning a way to talk about team dynamics with their peers. And we've seen this over and over with, I don't know, DISC is another popular one, right? The DISC is another type of sorter, very similar. You may have seen Coop Coopersmith. He's kind of famous for doing this, taking a room full of people and separating them very quickly into D, I, S, and C.
Yeah.
I've done it with small groups, and it's always not only fun and engaging, but it immediately gets a good conversation going that they can take further, whether or not they ever use DISC again, right? Or I like to use, for example, 6 hats, De Bono 6 hats. It's a wonderful way to get a conversation started around what are the different types of creative and problem-solving skills we need to bring into our team.
Yeah.
And let's just do I just have them do the most simplistic self-measurement of which color they are. I say, you know, just pick your hat. I'm only going to give you one hat. I know we're more than one, but for the sake of today, just what's your most instinctual response to a situation? And I define them very simply. You know, blue, you're the first person to go, wait, why are we going about it this way? You know, you're the process person. Red, you're the first one to go, what does this feel like? You immediately gravitate to what things feel like. And I go through the colors that way. And in 5 minutes, I can describe those 6 colors, the 6 hats. And I can ask people what their primary hat is, and they're pretty spot on. And then we can have a conversation about, wow, interesting, this table over here is all blue. There's only one green hat. What might that mean for our work together over the next week? And without ever implying that they are really just a blue hat, and that's what the box that they're stuck in. You know, I acknowledge that things are situational, that in this context, you will be more blue than red, right? We give people that freedom.
Well, I think that's it, because I mean, if I recall correctly, De Bono's take on it was, I think he described it as parallel thinking, which
Yeah.
the problem that happens in meetings, and we probably all have this as BAs, is the fact that, well, someone's being hypercritical, someone's in black hat mode, someone is looking at the sunshine, they're in yellow hat mode,
Right.
and someone's being creative in green hat mode, and
Right.
they're having about 30 conversations at once, whereas with parallel thinking, you're like, right, okay, actually now we're going to go into the red hat, and I just want you to emotionally react for this.
Yeah, and that's the utility. That's the useful side. Forget about whether there really is something in the world called blue hat people or red. It's like no one really cares about that. Is this useful? And when I'm working with the team and I say, hey, why don't we black hat this? Because we're all too rosy here. So we need a black hat right now.
So for anyone,
right? That's a really powerful thing.
Yeah. So for anyone who's not familiar with De Bono's hats, could you give a 30-second overview of the hat colors and
right.
type?
Well, okay, I'd love to. And it's funny, I was doing this in South Africa a few years ago when we were both there for the IIBA.
Yeah, I remember the flag, right?
And it turned out, by the end of it, as I walked through the colors, they gave me, you got one of these too, like a little takeaway flag, the one that they use at the soccer games. I like, oh my God, every one of the hats is reflected in their flag.
It's in the flag, yeah.
Right. So I already touched blue hats, process people. They're always kind of stepping back and observing how the group is going about doing what they're doing. And they ask that kind of question. It's the meta thinker. The white hat, very data driven. They just very neutral. They want data. Just we need to know a little bit more about this. And they're very averse to landing in one decision or another. Black, very quick to say, hey, this doesn't work. I know this isn't going to work. They're very quick to give a kind of counterpoint, right? To kick the tires hard. Greens are these. I'm very green. Can you tell? I love just popping ideas. So I'm
creativity.
Yeah. Yep. Let's wait. And then, they'll say to me, gosh, I thought we already settled this question. Why are you giving us another idea? Right. That's
Yeah.
Red, I already mentioned, very emotional. They really intuitively empathize and want to know. They can just tell what it feels like more than anything. They just are judging based on feeling more than anything else. And black, and green, and what I leave off? Yellow. Yeah, yellow. Yeah, yellow, I like to say, are the people who kind of can almost intuitively wired around a business case. How can we make a buck off this? Yeah. How will this sell up to the C-suite? They really have a sense of.
They're looking at the art, like what could be possible here. That's what I always think with the yellow, rather than the black that's thinking what could go wrong. The yellow's thinking what are the amazing possibilities? Because I don't know how you remember it, but I always in my mind think yellow like sunshine, green like green shoots of creativity, white like computer printout for data. Black,
good.
I think some of these I probably got from De Bono's books, but
no, it's great. Yeah, those are good. Yeah.
So okay, so we've talked about some of the downsides of assessment, like in schools and in measuring things that aren't useful, measuring things just because they're there. They clearly have a place though. Where can you give some examples or some situations where assessment has either worked well or would work well and would be useful?
Yeah. Well, I'll just tell you a little bit of a story about a client I was just working with. This company that's been maintaining a SaaS application for a couple decades, been classically waterfall for as much time. New CIO, new leadership team comes in, and they kind of look around going, where are the user stories or whatever? They can tell this is a very old school culture, old school application. And the opportunity was created for me to come in and do an agile assessment. And I always start when I'm working with a client like this with some kind of assessment. I typically don't come in with the 500 questionnaire. It's more like interviews. Mm-hmm. And the very first thing that I find, and this as a consultant too, this external set of eyes we bring to a situation, and the way we ask a question already kind of gives them a bit of a blue hat perspective, already kind of gets them to think a little bit outside what operationally they do day in and day out. So the very fact of, for an organization that hasn't been thinking about how they've been going about thinking, they've been doing things pretty much the same way for a long time, just starting to ask the questions, well, why are you doing this way? And how long has it been going on this way? And just beginning to assess that part, that's magic in a way. It's amazing how it begins to kick certain ideas off in them.
That, I mean,
Right. And that's a very lightweight assessment. I'm just, I'm just starting to interview people essentially. Right.
yeah, and that's really interesting because a phrase you used, and I don't know if you used it as like a throwaway phrase or
Yeah.
deliberately, but it really jumped out at me, was the thinking about thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's interesting, isn't it? 'Cause if you think about like what do we do as BAs? Well, we help organizations change. And in
Mm-hmm.
order for change to be effective and sustainable, well, we need to ensure that the organization continues to learn. Because if it
Mm-hmm.
just goes static, it's going to die, or
Yeah.
it's very, very likely to die because the environment will change around it, type of thing.
Yep.
So, because for me, thinking about thinking starts to get into like double loop learning and even triple loop learning. So,
Mhm.
so rather than saying, "Oh my God, there's a fire. How do we put it out?" We
Yeah.
move it on to, "Oh, well, there's a fire. Let's put it out. And why was the fire there in the first place?"
Yep.
Right through to, well, let's put it out. Why was it there in the first place? And let's systemically create a situation where there can never be a fire.
We don't have any more fires, right?
And fires don't exist, and our customers are happier, and we're making more money at the same time, type of thing.
And then roll forward a few more years, and it might, if they keep the double loop learning process, God, we need a fire. We need to light some fires around here. Right? Fires come back again.
Yeah, oscillation, backwards and forwards. But
Yeah, no, then they're controlled burns, right? Because that actually is a healthy thing for managing a forest ecosystem. You do controlled burns. But now that's a whole different level.
Yeah.
Right? We need a little fire. Yeah.
No, that's a conversation for another. Yeah. I was thinking with the systems dynamics and feedback loop hat
No,
on.
I love it. You're right on. That's spot on. And another thing that I think is useful is not just doing it once. So the journey and coming back just pick. Oh, okay. So it's built into Scrum teams, for example, that we retrospect after every 2 weeks.
Wow.
That's ideal. Okay.
Yeah, no. I know. I know, and I'm totally with the retrospective, but
right.
Is it always done effectively in your experience?
No, of course not. That's how I stay in business. I teach people how to do better retrospectives.
Oh, wow.
I have a whole workshop called "How Funky Is Your Chicken?"
What?
I don't know. It doesn't make any sense, but it's clickbait. I got the Michael Jackson theme song going, play some Jackson 5, and then we get into retrospectives.
Okay.
So no, but here's where I'm going with this. That the whole beauty of that, and this was part of the brilliance of Agile and these methods, was building feedback cycles in.
Yes.
One-time assessments are one thing. Feedback cycles are very powerful, right? This is where that double loop learning starts, right?
Yeah, and feedback is interesting because like if you go into most organizations and say feedback, they're like, okay, well, yeah, everyone gets an end of year feedback and we ask each other for feedback, and but like in my view, and I'm not sure I've seen any organization that does this particularly well, because it's hard to do. It's hard to even talk about really with an organization, but it's like you need that recursive feedback at different levels, right? Individuals need to get feedback, but actually subsystems within there need to get feedback from their environment and internally as to whether they're working or not. And you need to get you need to also like and I know we're straying a little bit from the point, but like we talked about agility versus agile as a delivery mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
If we've got business agility, that organization needs to be listening to its external environment and hearing oh wow, like the market's not changing, but there's a predictor that something's going to happen. So now I need to signal someone to make a decision about, well, do we keep doing what we're doing? And I could reel out the cliched examples like Kodak and Nokia, but organizations now can the technology is there to enable change to happen quickly.
Yeah.
The thing which stops change happening is normally, I mean, at least in my experience, yours may be different, but is either real technical legacy, which people have let happen, or perceived legacy, or just inaction. But when I say inaction, I don't mean deliberate inaction. It's not knowing a decision's necessary, or taking forever to get the data to make the decision, or not deciding how to decide. And if you don't decide how to decide, you can never decide.
Say that 3 times. Yeah. Yeah, you hit on something there that I wanted to come back to. Well, we were talking about utility of assessments, right? And that got us into feedback loops. So I'm saying let's do them frequently. Let's get multiple feedback loops going. And you were getting something important, multiple levels.
Yeah, with communication
I love
between those levels.
Yes,
as well.
yes. I love the work recently. I would just commend people to check out the work of Jutta Eckstein and John Buck with their book Bossa Nova. They've combined, BOSSA is an acronym that pulls together several different strands. Beyond budgeting is the B. So that comes out of the work of Bjartis Bognes and others, which is looking at, the world moving as fast as it does. Annual budgets probably don't make sense anymore. There's other ways to do dynamic budgeting and so forth. And then there's open space technology. That's the OS in BOSSA. The idea of, and you referred, I think, implicitly to Cynefin and to complex environments.
Yes.
A better way to do problem solving in complex, timely, urgent environments is through things like open space technology, where we break down many traditional structures, get a lot of great ideas on the table where people are passionate about solving them. And then the S in Bossa Nova is sociocracy, which is really what this whole holacracy movement, if people have been tracking that, which has gotten a lot of attention, it's really based on sociocracy.
So is this the kind of self-organizing team element?
It's really, there's a lot of work that's been done. John Buck contributed a lot to that part of the book. Jutta comes from the Agile world and many classic kind of Agile transformations. So double-linked learning, double-linked feedback loops, it's all in there. So multiple directions of feedback up and down the org chart.
Yeah.
And as much as possible, flattening the org chart where we can.
Yeah.
You and I talked a long time ago about task forces versus committees.
Yes, we did.
Inside of something like as silly as a BA chapter, an IIBA chapter. That's exactly the right kind of thinking, but at enterprise scale. Much more dynamic, short-lived teams that compose, decompose, that kind of stuff.
Dynamic and organic rather than hierarchical and command control.
And more self-managed, right.
Yeah.
And the last one is agility. So the BOSSA, B-O-S-S-A, is just all the great attributes of what we already come to realize were pretty foundationally good. The Agile Manifesto had some great ideas. And there's only one line in the manifesto you need to change, which is we're learning better ways of making software. We're learning better ways of evolving our organization. If you do that and you take the word software out and just put value in its place, it's still very contemporary. It still reads very well.
Yeah.
Together and you get Bossa Nova.
Or we're continually learning.
Yes.
Although ironic, as far as I'm aware, the manifesto itself hasn't been updated since 2001.
Yeah, and there's been repeated attempts to do it, and they've repeatedly just decided, you know what, it was a milestone event. We're going to leave it just where it was.
It's a snapshot, and individual groups or practitioners can riff and build on it. So I just wanted to rewind a little bit, because you used a term that some people tuning in might not be familiar with, which is Cynefin, and there is absolutely no chance in the short time we have left that we can explain that concept. But if you're not familiar, if you're listening in and you haven't heard of Cynefin, so Cynefin came from Dave Snowden and his colleagues. I think he was at IBM when he came up.
I think so, yeah.
But now Cognitive Edge is the company he works for, and Cynefin is, I guess, a sense-making framework. Would you describe it?
That's exactly the way to describe it, yeah.
Different domains, so, a simple domain versus a complex, a complicated, a chaotic, or disorder in the middle. If you Google Cynefin, which is a Welsh word, I'm told the nearest English translation is habitat. But it's C-Y. I can never say things without C-Y-N-E-F-I-N.
Right, that's right.
Cynefin.
Yes.
A fascinating read, and I'd encourage you. And there's lots of, in the Harvard Business Review. So Snowden and Boone was one of the first articles I'm aware of back in about 2000. So
and I'm glad you mentioned that, because a long time ago I worked for my dad as an electrician, right out of high school.
An electrician?
I was an electrician.
You're practicing
running pipe and pulling wire. So
wow.
I worked for this Cuban electrician, master electrician, craftsman, really cool guy named Claudio. He said, Guri, you have to use the right tools for the right job. And he didn't know how brilliant that was. It's always come back to me, over and over again. And I think that's the sense making element
Yeah,
here.
yeah,
The right tool for the right job. Assessments are not all for every situation, right?
and this is it, because I think a lot of problems that happen in the BA and project world is because like best practice, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Well, best practice has a place, and in fact, there being best practice out there is useful because you can take it and adapt it. But the key is and adapt it,
Yeah.
because unless you're dealing with exactly the same environment, exactly the same stakeholder types, exactly the same level of volatility, market competition, whatever, it's probably not going to work, right? Like, even if things are relatively predictable, I'm pretty sure pilots look at the flight plan, even if they've done that flight so many times, because the weather changes, right?
Yeah, right,
So,
exactly. Yeah.
so sense-making frameworks like Cynefin encourage us as practitioners to think, well, actually, this is this is simple. So yeah, there's an off-the-shelf solution. We probably we don't need to spend a lot of time here. It can be quite traditional.
Right.
But actually, if it's complex, there's going to be some emergent stuff. We've got to be careful we don't end up just taking the first solution and causing more problems than we, displacing the problem to another department. That classic thing where you implement it here, everyone's happy, and
Yeah.
people over the
And
fence.
let's go back and be brutally honest. The Agile Industrial Complex is famous for that.
I love that.
That's why I don't start like a client journey, the one I did with my client, with some standard Agile Alliance or Scrum Alliance measurement. I start with conversation.
Yeah.
Because I know I'm in a complex domain. I know they're in a complex domain. And I want to just understand as widely and as broadly as possible what's the context of what's going on here. First,
yeah. And again,
I never lead with a tool like
and that's it. It's like, because I know you and I are both, we both. Agility is something we would both always endorse, and agile can definitely be a part of that. But the kind of, what is it, like the cargo cult, some people call it, culture, can become an issue where it's like, well, we're doing all of the ceremonies and we're not getting the outcome. It's like, well, that's because the principles and the culture and all the other things around it aren't there.
And I've found that there's, you can imagine, I'm going to bring my own, or not mine, but I will bring the situationally appropriate version of Scrum to this client.
Yeah.
And they get nervous when it deviates from what they've read online as classic canonical Scrum, right? I'm giving them permission to try Kanban, to do other things, to even use waterfall in some places, right? And that makes people nervous until they have a bigger frame to put around it and set all those things in and see why we're adapting. But that takes some time and some trust with a client.
Yeah, because it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because I'm thinking on my feet here, but agile delivery methodologies would encourage us to have short feedback loops on the product.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
How about adapting the product that's delivering the product? Right.
That's exactly what we say. Right. We want to teach agile and do agile by being agile. So like I started with 2 pilot teams. And I'm actively using them as 2 little laboratories. And I specifically said to the first Scrum Master, I want you to try doing paper radars, put things up on the wall. Even though we have them digitized, I want this team to try using more paper artifacts, visual things, right? And I want this other team to be pure digital. We want to get some learning in the first few sprints between these 2 teams, see what's the difference, right? But the instinct in most organizations, let's have all teams doing it exactly the same.
Yeah, irrespective of the context or project. And that kind of brings me onto another tangent, really, which is we hear lots of words around like assessments and benchmarks. Like you hear framework and tool and technique and method and methodology. Those words are similar but aren't really synonymous in a way.
I'm glad you brought that up. Yes. I mean, we all know some frameworks, whether it's a Zachman or
fully an ontology. Ontological framework. I'm messing with you.
You've probably seen him speak. Lovable, delightful old man. I shouldn't say old man. He's a great guy. But you can get his dander up if you confuse his framework with a methodology.
Yes.
So, and he's right about this. A framework, if I give another example of one that I like a lot, I'll just share a screen again. There's a couple I think that give good examples of what we mean by a framework. One is out of Enterprise Design Associates. They call it the Enterprise Design Stack. I like the book they wrote called Intersection,
Yes.
and the conference by the same name. Very similar to Zachman, this is specifying a set of elements that we should be paying attention to. Ontology, that's simply what that means. It means a set of terms with meanings. There's usually a hierarchy, there's a relationship between the things. I won't go into this framework, but that's not to be confused with, let's say, a design process, a method such as the design sprint out of Google.
Yes.
Which will take customers very much along this journey, right? Like when you do a design sprint with Google, and if you combine these two ideas, it's very powerful. It's one of the reasons Milan is one of the progenitors of this design framework. He likes the design sprint from Google because you can walk through these different elements of this framework in the process of doing a design sprint. But this is much more prescriptive. On day 1, thou shalt. On day 2, thou shalt. On day 3, day 4, day 5, it's a 5-day sprint.
And this is one of the things that I think sometimes confuses stakeholders or like, so you take the BA-BOK.
Yeah.
So, and my view is very firmly the BA-BOK, it's a framework. It isn't a method. In fact, but it has there are dependencies between different elements of it. And I was having a conversation. I think I was having this conversation with Kevin Brennan of all people. And I mean, you and I, if people aren't aware, Kevin Brennan worked for IIBA for many, many years. He did most jobs over those years, but was heavily involved with BA-BOK. Yeah. And we were riffing on this, and I was saying it's kind of like the difference between a chef type of thing. We sort of, it's like what I think what people sometimes look for in BA-BOK is they're looking for a recipe. Right? and BA-BOK doesn't give you a recipe. It's
not a cookbook. It's not a cookbook.
Yeah, a cookbook. Right. But it's like a framework of ideas, which is like your
ingredients.
Your ingredients, or sometimes not even your ingredients, but the classes of ingredients.
Yes, it might tell you, it's a higher level, right?
Yeah, it's like, well, root cause analysis is useful, and you might want to do it in this sort of area. And here are a couple of techniques, but it's not saying these are the only techniques, right? But it's saying these are the sorts of things to do. So it's like, well, whereas a method might take some of the ingredients in BA-BOK and string them together. But I think more and more as BAs, or certainly I'm finding, the value isn't in taking a one-size-fits-all approach and saying, well, let's do RUP, and let's do RUP by the book, or or whatever. Or it's about saying, okay, well, you know what, your constraints are X, Y, Z. The environment's pressing in. Well, let's do this, mix that and that, and then let's have regular points where we see whether it's working. If it's not working, we'll change it.
Absolutely.
And so I remember. I mean, Peter Checkland, who came up with, well, him and his team at Lancaster University, who came up with soft systems methodology, had, like, because I think people were starting to use his methodology very, very literally. And he wrote, and I think I've seen him on YouTube saying, I mean, it's quite, I guess, an academic argument, but he's like, no, methodology isn't method, it's the logos of method. And, and unfortunately, I forget what that, there's some, I guess, Greek.
It loosely means the rationale for it, the philosophy behind it, right?
Yeah.
The logos.
Yeah. So
it's the Greek word that's the root of the word logic.
Yeah. So it's a case of, well, actually, you shouldn't take a methodology and apply it. You should adapt it to the context.
Bad. Exactly.
Yeah. So okay. So we got just the last few minutes left. I mean, what would you say? Because we've talked about so many things as I knew we would, and it's. But what does all this mean for, like, if we've got all sorts of BAs tuned in from all sorts of industries, even more watch the recording. What does it mean for us as a community? What are assessments, like so what kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. Now, or the now what, right?
Yeah.
So what? Now what? Right? It's another framework. So what? I think that one of the things we're aligned with, and I think a lot of people on this call would agree with, is that, as you were just saying, we're not going to use the tool just because it's there. We're going to adapt. So we're going to always be situationally aware. That's just a good ground rule. I think we touched on, and I would underline again, the value of taking people on the journey of self-discovery and self-assessment.
Mm-hmm.
There's great value, whether it's as simple as a 6 hats exercise or MBTI. Sorry, it is useful in that context.
Yeah. I
Just
buy that.
don't pay your MBTI consultant, 10 grand to come in and do it. Just download a simple, version of it off the web.
As skeptical as I am,
I am, but not. Yeah.
I do think it's useful. And what's really funny is a friend and colleague of mine was saying she'd had an MBTI assessment done, and I was like, "Can I guess?" And she said, "Go on." And I said, "You're INTJ." And she said, "Yeah." I'm like,
yeah.
"How do you
had
know
a
that?" I'm like,
spirit.
because I'm one, and you're
exactly.
that's what we
Takes
work.
one to know one. Yeah. And sidebar, I mean, you're an NT, I'm an NT. I have a hunch a lot of BAs have that NT, those middle 2 letters. I would be my guess. But anyway, the journey is the reward. Do it more than once, right? Keep coming back. That gets the feedback cycle going. When I work, I showed you the Discovery Leadership Radar, and that one was not effective. But one of the radars that Sally's team has, the Team Health Radar, is super effective because it gets the team talking about, and they're owning their own solution. So they start thinking about the problem creatively. They take the assessment together. It's 360 degrees, so they're evaluating each other. They even invite customers to evaluate the team. So think about it. The people you deliver to week by week, stakeholders, you're now asking them every so often, how are we doing?
Yeah.
How could we deliver better?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The product owner's evaluated, the developer lead, everyone is getting evaluated. 360, there's lots of transparency there, a lot of power. And then the most important thing is develop a growth path out of it. And that is when the team begins to accelerate, because, or any organization, if they're owning their own change, and here's the things we can change as a team, and here's the things that have to rise up 1 or 2 more levels in the organization because they're deeper impediments or deeper opportunities, that's where assessments are super useful, right? But I think they need to be owned at the level where the information is.
Yeah.
That's the thing, not coming from someone's imported framework. If the more we let teams own them and people own their own assessments, they will do amazing things, right?
Yeah, and make sure they're aligned with.
Yeah, we get out of the business of performance reviews too. We can change that whole paradigm.
Yeah. So
people want to excel. People generally want to grow in their job, right? We all want to get better.
This is it. No, I don't think many people come to work thinking, "How can I really screw up today?" Right? There might be a few, but so final thought then, Curtis. So in 30 seconds or less, because this has been quite an emergent conversation. And I mean that in a positive way. But what's one thing that's unexpected or useful that you're kind of taking away from today's conversation?
Well, I'm so happy you mentioned double link learning, and now I'm going to write a podcast or do an episode about controlled forest fire burns.
Yeah. And I think for me, something you said at the very beginning, that penny drop moment, that actually, as is to be, that's in the form of assessment. BAs were assessing all the time. We just don't call it assessment. And maybe we need to, as a community, think about learning from other communities that assess in different ways. And maybe I need to get over my skepticism of MBTI as well. That's a learning.
I got a better one for you. It's called Enneagram.
Okay. Yeah.
ENNEAGRAM. Enneagram. 9-pointed star, nine different profiles. See, not 16. A little simpler. Mm-hmm. And you're a 9, by the way. You're a 9, Enneagram 9. And I know you hate that. I've already put you in a box. Right?
I'm going to look up what that means. Maybe after the call, if you could send me a link to some of these things, I can put them on the site if people want to take a look.
I'm glad to. Yeah.
Great. Well, really, all there's left to say, because we're right on the finish line, is thank you so much, Curtis, for being part of this this conversation, and also a massive thank you to everyone who's tuned in live and who's watching the recording. As a reminder that really what we set out to do with the BA Community webinar series, and it's a couple of years ago now this started, but was to address topics that are a bit around the periphery of analysis. So to really encourage us as practitioners to think perhaps beyond how can I write a better use case. It's not to say writing a better use case isn't important, but there's lots of other stuff about that out there. So after the call, if you're tuned in, you will get a little email with a short questionnaire, just 3 questions. Would love it if you could fill that in. One of the questions is, what other topics should we cover? And if there's a topic you want to see, let me know, because I'll try and find someone who can talk about that. Let us know if you like the format with the video. That's always a good thing to know as well. And we also have the next webinar. I'm desperately searching. Here it is, 15th of August, and it's entitled. It's a discussion panel, and it'll be business analysis and systems analysis, closely connected or miles apart. In so many organizations, systems analysis has kind of disappeared into a void. So that'll be an interesting conversation as well.
Right.
So once again, massive thank you, Curtin. I guess it's afternoon your time, so
yes.
Good afternoon and see you soon.
Thanks so much, Adrian.
Thanks everyone. Bye.